Now, let's get back to the news of the Paris Climate Change Agreement and the fact that today India will ratify that treaty after signing it at the meeting in Paris several months ago. And for more on this story and more analysis, we're joined live by Neha Sinha. She's an environmentalist and a writer. Neha, thank you very much for joining me to talk about this story in more detail. Let's start off first with that agreement that India are now officially ratifying today. What's your immediate reaction? Is this a historic moment for India?
It's absolutely a very historic moment for India. I mean, there are at least two reasons why. The first is that it's very symbolic that we are ratifying on the day of, which is associated with Mahatma Gandhi. I think it's a very strong political message that India is sending out to the rest of the world, because Gandhi was very much an icon of sustainable development and of environmental justice. The second is on a political level or even a realistic level. This is very important because India is sending out a strong message to the world stage. We've been known as obstructionists in the climate change politics for a very long time. So the fact that we have actually ratified, and the fact that we are such a fast growing economy, but we are not afraid to kind of climb on the bandwagon along with developed nations, it's a very strong political message.
Yeah, I want to ask you later on actually about the current sort of environmental, the activism that's going on in India at the moment and what sort of level that's at. But I just want to ask you if you could explain the difference for our viewers between signing the Paris climate deal in Paris and actually ratifying. What's the difference between those two stages?
Yeah, I mean, if we remember, we had the Kyoto Protocol before this for climate change, and the United States very famously agreed to sign it but did not ratify it. So ratification means when you go back home to your own country and your political leaders, your parliament agrees to come on board. So it becomes a legally binding commitment for the country. So signing on is more of a symbolic gesture. Ratification is saying that we mean business. And India, of course, has been part of the Kyoto Protocol before. And the fact that India has taken it forward to ratify the Paris Accord after signing it earlier means that we mean business. And the second thing I want to say about ratification of the Paris Accord is that the developed and the developing world has always been sort of fighting with each other as far as climate change is concerned. And right now we have both on the same accord. So we have US and we have China and we have Brazil, Argentina, India, very big economies, but the US of course is the developed world and the rest are still developing. The fact that we're all coming forward to ratify means that there's this shared commitment towards the world as a sort of shared home for all of us. So ratification basically means that the country means business, and the country will put in place domestic legislation, domestic policy and domestic action to take forward their global commitment.
All right, Neha, if you could just stay on the line with us, we're just going to get some more background on this Paris climate change agreement, as well as India's move. Obviously, today, at least 30 countries will formally join the Paris Agreement on climate change on Wednesday. And this next report gives you a bit of a breakdown of the history of UN climate talks.
On December 12, 2015, after intense UN talks at COP21 in Paris, 195 nations agreed the world's first universal climate accord to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and 1.5 degrees Celsius if possible. It's the culmination of 2 decades of diplomacy over how to divide responsibility and financing between rich and developing nations, between the worst polluters and countries most vulnerable to climate change. Developing countries are set to receive a minimum of $100 billion a year from 2020 when the deal takes effect. Since the first summit on sustainable development in 1972 in Stockholm, environmental issues have slowly crept up the international agenda. The 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro laid the foundations of green diplomacy. It resulted in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Every year since 1995, the Conference of Parties to the Convention, known as COP, brings together signatory states to try to combat climate change by reducing emissions.
This annual summit also formed the basis for 1997's Kyoto Protocol. The treaty committed 37 industrialised countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 5.2% against 1990 levels by 2012. But no restrictions were imposed on developing countries like China and India, despite both being significant polluters. In 2009, COP15 in Copenhagen failed to deliver a new global treaty. It ended instead with a non-binding agreement to take action to keep temperature increases below 2 degrees Celsius without explaining how this would happen. The COP17 summit in 2011 resulted in the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, committing countries including the United States and China to deliver a new legally binding agreement in 2015.
All right, a breakdown there for you of UN climate talks down through the years. And we've still got Neha Sinha, who's an environmentalist and a writer, on the line with us. Neha, if I could just follow up from that, you said that in your last answer before we played that report that this means India means business. What is this practically going to mean for Indian business, Indian industry, for example? How difficult is it going to be for India to implement the kinds of changes that they'll need to?
Right. It's a very interesting question because we are looking at Made in India right now, and we're looking at these big programs for industrialization in India, especially with Narendra Modi being very strong on startups and industrialization in India. So I think this comes at, the Paris Accord comes at a very good time. A very important thing to note is that we're looking at reducing emission intensity by about 35%. By 2030. So this means that we are going to continue to grow, but we are going to be reducing the amount of emissions we have per unit of GDP. So perhaps more factories, more industrialization, but really cleaner growth is what we are looking at. So I think we are going to have more of an emphasis on renewable energy, on retrofitting buildings, and on retrofitting practices that we have right now so that we can use less energy. And also a lot of carbon sequestration. Planting trees, which is seen as a very old-fashioned way of combating climate change, is also part of the program that India has suggested. And finally, we are going to be looking at really ramping up solar power and wind power. The good thing is, the nice thing is, it's all being done on India's terms. These are all targets that India has set domestically, and the way India goes forward in its industrialization now will be set on terms that the parliament decides, that the people decides, which is a very good thing for the country, but while keeping in mind our legal commitment, which we are now making for the international scenario. So more industrialization, yes, but hopefully cleaner power, better energy use practices which really cut down on energy consumption, and a whole bunch of mitigation and carbon sequestration strategies.
All right, well, let's, if I may, let's just broaden this out beyond India and beyond South Asia. The Paris Climate Change Pact will come into effect when 55 countries sign it and when a threshold of 55% of the global carbon emissions is signed up. So when that threshold is passed, and it looks like it probably will be in the coming days, the pact will come through in 30 days after that. Do you think there's a realistic chance that we could see this pact completely ratified by the end of the year, for example?
I think it's the first time that it's realistic, you know, as far as climate politics is concerned. I think the whole world has really been shaken by a whole bunch of natural and extreme events. I mean, we've had a very hot summer, and we've had tornadoes and hurricanes everywhere. And I think for the first time the world is serious, and they've put aside their bickering between developed and developing nations. I'm 100% confident the accord will come through this year itself. We've already reached about almost 47% of global emissions. Countries that are accounting for 47% of global emissions have already ratified. So we need to touch 55% of global emissions, and I'm very sure we're going to do that by the end of the year. And it's really good because we don't have any time. So I'm very positive that it'll work out.
All right, just before we go, Neha, I just want to ask you, you've been very positive about the Paris Pact, but some of its critics say that the terms of that deal are not enough to keep the global temperature rise below that 2-degree threshold that they've said is so crucial. What's your analysis of that? Do you think the deal is strong enough?
You know, I think the Kyoto Protocol really tried to be very strict with the developed world, with the Annex One world as it's so called. And I don't think it works, because I think every country is interested in its own profit, in its own growth trajectory. So what I'm trying to suggest is being too strict will never work, because we are, you know, all profit-driven economies. We are all interested in our own self-interest. So something like a Paris Accord, which has a fair amount of space for domestic action and kind of more of a voluntary action, is really what's going to work in the world today. I agree with critics that it's perhaps a little too less, but I would take a little too less over nothing at all. And I think the Kyoto Protocol failed because a few countries like the EU thought that they were following it, and the rest of the developed world was not. And it was just too difficult. The emission cuts were too difficult to follow, and nobody just did it. So something like this, which is less ambitious, is definitely more reachable, in my opinion.
All right, we're going to leave it there. But thank you very much, Neha Sinha, who's an environmentalist and a columnist. Thank you very much for your analysis of this historic day, really, for India as they ratify the Paris Climate Change Agreement. We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, more international news and news from South Asia. Stay with us.